Hi, and welcome to another in our Gardener Tech video series. On this occasion, we're going to be taking a look at something that's increasingly important, and that is the protection of data on our NAS devices. Increasingly, NAS is becoming almost a default storage option in an awful lot of cases. Now, it's now moved on from just somewhere where we put our file shares to now somewhere where we're hosting virtual machines, somewhere where we're hosting databases. So being able to protect the data on that is increasingly important and increasingly crucial to our strategy. So today we're going to take a look at how Veeam are helping us to address that with some new NAS data protection capabilities they've introduced. And to help me to go through that, I'm joined today by Senior Global Technologist, Michael Cade. Hi, Michael. How are you?
Hey, Paul. Yeah, I'm all good, thank you.
Well, thanks for joining us today. And I know this is a topic that you speak a lot about and the importance of NAS backup. So why don't you, well, first maybe introduce yourself and then talk a little bit about kind of what Veeam are doing in this space and why they've identified NAS data protection as such a core issue they have to address.
Yeah, cheers, Paul. So I sit in the product strategy team at Veeam. So what does that actually mean? I get to speak to our customers, I get to speak to our alliance partners, as well as our product management and marketing side. So I try and blend the gap and hopefully make our product go in the right direction so that we're helping you guys out as customers, as well as obviously bringing the most required functionality to the product set that we have there. Based on a lot of content as well. I do a lot of the event speaking, that sort of stuff, as well is part of my remit. My focus for the last probably at least 9 months has been around our enhanced NAS backup. We've done a few shows on what this and also some real particular deep dives on this as well, and we can include those in the show notes as well. But the premise of what we want to touch on is really why now, and I'll get into a bit of what we've got today or what we had pre-version 10. We'll touch on the components, and the real important part from a Veeam point of view is that yes, there are new components here, but it should just slot into everything that you already know from a Veeam point of view. It's very much around that simplified approach. We're going to touch on the backup is probably the key part of how we protect that data, but also the restore, how do we restore that data, and how we differentiate to other options in the market. And then finally, we're going to touch on the search monitoring and reporting aspects that we've also thought about and brought to the product. And then we'll end with a demo of a bit of a walkthrough of what it looks like for existing Veeam customers, and also a bit about that restore functionality as well, if we've got time. So, what do we have today, or what do we have pre-version 10? So, pre-version 10. So, bearing in mind, Veeam have been around for 12, 13 years now, focused on virtualization to begin with. Over the last 2-3 years, we've really broadened that platform out to better protect physical workloads, cloud workloads, etc. And NAS was really the last thing that we hadn't really focused on at any sort of scale. So pre-version 10, we had the ability to send files to tape, but it was very much SMB based solution. It wasn't very scalable. Plus, it was kind of limited to tape as well at that point. The same with NDMP to tape. Is a lot of our enterprise customers required NDMP. Now, I don't know if this was an industry thing, but we found that a lot of RFPs were asking for this. And technically, yeah, we could do that, but technically it's not necessarily the right thing to be doing, because it's just going to reduce the amount of flexibility that you have from a recovery point of view. One of the biggest challenges being single file restore from NDMP backups. That's an issue. But also slowness and speed of that. So if we just dive back into the why now as well from a V10. So there's two aspects. One is advantages of, so the advantage being, well, we've waited 13 years. We've seen a lot in the industry over the last 13 years. We've spoken to a lot of customers where they've had unstructured data or NAS data that they need to protect. And so we've learned a lot of the challenges that they have with their existing backup tools, or even, which is quite scary, is that the amount of people that don't actually have a solid backup or a strategy on being able to back up that NAS data. They may have a kind of a solution in that they might use storage snapshots, which is great until something happens to the storage. They might not do anything because their time constraints, they don't allow for that backup window or that downtime. So we had a lot of advantages into understanding the challenges around what people had today or prior to V10, or as well as obviously the growth of that data. So we've heard on pretty much every webcast, every video recording demo that you've heard, is that the growth of data is exponentially growing out of control. And so that was another thing. We have to be able to scale this NAS backup. It's not just a tick box for today. It has to be there for the future, and it has to future-proof us and our customers for the long term. So simple, reliable, or simple, flexible, and reliable, it should be in that order really, is that simplicity is a key mantra of Veeam and our technologies, is that it has to be really easy and simple to use, has to have that wizard-driven approach, and it also has to scale. That architecture needs to scale accordingly, depending on the size of business. We've got customers with 5 virtual machines or five instances. We've got customers with 50,000 VMs or 50,000 instances. So and it's the same software defined model. You pick and choose where you want to back up to. Being a backup company, we kind of need to make sure that we're reliable. But not only that, obviously that's a kind of a given. That's table stakes. If we weren't reliable, then we wouldn't have as many customers as we do. But we have to be very fast at being able to recover that data, as well as being granular, being able to perform fast incremental backups, all of that good stuff around being able to search and do that at scale as well. And then being able to be flexible. And this is one of the key differentiators that I'm going to get into from a NAS point of view, is scalability. I've touched on pretty much on both of those other headings, but people don't just have, or people tend to not just have one NAS source or one source of their unstructured data. They might have a Windows file server, and it only might contain data for one subset of the business. And then they might have a NAS device serving out SMB or NFS for the majority of the business. So having that ability to be able to protect multiple NAS sources using the same wizard-driven approach means that we bring that flexibility to that. Also, over the last 6 months, maybe 9, we've seen a lot of cloud-based file services appear in the likes of Azure and Microsoft Azure and AWS. So being able to protect those, because they leverage the same protocols, but again, we want to use the same simple, flexible, and reliable software system that we have to be able to do that. And then also flexible licensing. I'm not going to get into the licensing too much. Maybe that's another session for another time, but the flexibility of the licensing being instance-based means that we can move licenses with the workloads or with the data, or even just trash the workloads and move it to another data point or workload. So if we jump in now just into what does that actually mean from a components point of view. So I mentioned around the flexibility. So there's four key protocols or file servers that we support with our new NAS backup. One is SMB file shares, and you're going to see all the versions on the screen, 1, 2, and 3, as well as NFS file shares on 3 and 4.1. But then, like I mentioned, there's going to be some customers out there that maybe have Windows file servers and Linux file servers. Now, these are also covered or can be covered, and it might be more cost effective that way to cover it using an image-based backup tool, like our agent, like our virtual approach to being able to protect them. But we also have the ability to protect them using NAS backup. So that's just going to come down to how you guys want to really approach that from a backup point of view. But the key thing is that looks the same. When we get into the demo, I'll show you what that actually looks like and how it looks very similar to, well, each protocol, each source looks exactly the same when you add that. 3 different advanced transport modes. So this is how are we going to get the data from production or from that NAS or from that source to our backup, our short-term retention. So we could do it, and by default, it's going to be backup directly from the file share. So think about how file locks, open files, etc., may not, or may be hard to get hold of at that point. So, but we've got that ability to do it. We can also leverage VSS snapshot. Now, there's 2 points to this. One is when we use a component of our file proxy, which is the lift and shift of data from A to B, we can leverage VSS snapshot if it's supported on that Windows operating system. Now, one thing to mention also is if your NAS device supports remote VSS, then we will also trigger remote VSS at that point as well. So I'll use the example of like NetApp ONTAP. They support VSS snapshots really because of their Hyper-V implementation or their support for Hyper-V. But this allows us to leverage that ONTAP snapshot then as the source to be able to pull the data from there. So then that removes the requirement of that direct from file share at the top. So those file locks, etc., are no longer a problem. If your system doesn't expose that remote VSS, then we've also got the ability to back up from native storage snapshots. So providing they expose the snapshot folder, then we've got the ability to use that as the source. Also, this could be a replicated volume full of unstructured data, and we could actually just use this option to back up from that secondary copy of that data. So that's another flexible way of being able to protect and use the most appropriate backup method for that.
Yeah, and I think that that point actually you've just made there is kind of something that you've talked about through that introduction, is the importance of flexibility and not being overly tied to any particular solution. So, you know, as long as it's presenting NAS, and whether that's SMB or NFS, you're going to be able to protect it and offer some strong Veeam protection and recovery capability around that. You know, we're not tied to it only works with certain things, it only works with certain storage vendors, or it only works with certain types of, you know, file servers. We're looking at this kind of increasingly growing amount of data that we would call unstructured, you know, and like we said in the introduction, some of that might include databases sat on an SMB share, might include Hyper-V or VMware hosts sat on inside of a share, but the increasing amount of stuff that people are storing in these kind of file level protocols, as opposed to what we would have seen traditionally where they're presenting that as block. It means we have to meet all of these flexible requirements. And has it been that kind of changing need that you've seen? Because as you talked about, you know, this is something relatively new to Veeam. You know, lots of people will have talked about that they've been able to back up NAS protocols for a long time. But this has allowed Veeam to kind of take a little bit of a step back and look at the problem as it stands today and be able to solve modern data management problems, as opposed to being too tied to a legacy approach for doing the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. One of the things with Veeam is that we're not just wanting to tick that box on the RFP. If we bring something out to the market, we want to make sure that it changes the way in which we approach that data management challenge. And to the point as well, Paul, around the so yes, the flexibility of being able to protect multiple sources, but I think you also want to know that there's a lot of flexibility, and people move from SMB to Windows, or Windows to SMB, or NFS to Linux, and I think that flexibility is also there. And another use case that we saw is that around migrations. One of our restore functionality, and I'll get to that later on, is that, well, I can take an SMB backup and I can restore that to Windows, or I can take a NFS and I can restore that back to Linux, and vice versa. And there's a lot of flexibility when it comes to those migration tools. Yes, we're calling it NAS backup, but there's actually migration paths that you could use with the product as well. So the next new component that we haven't touched on, or this is very, very much new in terms of Veeam backup and replication, is the cache repository. Now, the cache repository is just a simple repository. It's just a disk repository that you've added to Veeam backup and replication that stores the checksums. Now, the checksums are what's allowing, and I'll get into more detail around what this is, but one of the differentiators that we saw was, well, we need to be able to take a fast incremental backup. One of the challenges around NDMP is that we have to walk the whole file system. We have to understand what's changed before we then take the backup. And this is a massive challenge, especially if you get into millions or billions even of files and petabytes of data. It takes a very long time to even just perform that incremental. So what we wanted to do was have a very fast way of being able to understand what's changed since the last backup, so that we could then just pinpoint those change files and take that backup. That's really the role of the cache repository. This stores something called a vcache file, and this is a list of what has changed or what changed in that backup compared to the one before. It runs in RAM. It's just a simple repository, so you just name it something and you use it when you add the file share. Again, I'll show you that as when we go through the demo. The important thing to note here is this should be on the quickest tier of storage that you have, and it should be as close to the NAS source as possible. Just simply because this is going to be processing or it's going to be telling the file proxies what's changed since the last backup. So just to recap on some of those areas that I've just touched on. So one is the flexibility. So being able to use as a source any of those protocols or file servers. This change file tracking, I'm going to get into a little bit more detail next on that, as well as the snapshot friendly. So how can we leverage those hardware storage snapshot to make our life easier from that point of view? Then recovery is another important aspect that we're going to touch on, but worth mentioning here is that, again, when you look at NDMP based solutions, you are very limited in what you can do from a recovery point of view, especially when it comes to entire file share recovery. You are limited to recover that back to its original location or to something very much the same as that original location, i.e. the same hardware, the same type, the same operating system, etc. We've got the ability, as I mentioned, is that we can take that entire file share backup and we can recover that somewhere else. No ties into the original location. I'll skip ahead to the point in time, because the point in time is actually another differentiator. Is we also have the ability to do file level recovery, and with that we work on a version control type system, in that we can understand, because we're backing up versions of files, you can be very granular in what and when you recover which files and folders back into your production or into a different location. Again, you're not tied into that. And it's extremely fast because of the metadata that we're using. We're only mounting the metadata at the point of recovery, so that we're very fast and we can see all of those restore points and data points to recover from. And the most important one is this point in time. So for those that remember back in the day, like Windows Vista or Windows 7 even, this last known good configuration. So you boot up your system and it doesn't work. It then does a reboot loop and you get your black screen with some white text, and it says last known good configuration, as well as things like safe mode. Think of that point in time as last known good configuration. And what that's going to do is allow for a quick rollback to the last backup that you made. So think about ransomware. Think about a ransomware attack, in that if that's happened, you've remediated the threat, but let's say it's encrypted half of your NAS share. The only option is to be able to restore from backup. We know that our backups are in a good state, and we want to be able to recover that back. What this does is kind of similar to a differential restore, is that we understand what's changed since the last backup. So it's just going to roll back all of those modified files since the last backup. I'll try and show that in the demo if we've got time as well. So just to get into the change file tracking. So here we've got like a file structure, file and folder structure. And on day one, we're going to have to walk the whole file system. That's just the way it is. We're not magicians. We have to take the whole backup. But then we store something called that vcache of, well, this is how it looked on day one. Then we come back, and day two, we've made some additional changes, emulated by the thumbprint here. So the green thumbprint that you see on file D was the only file that was changed in this tree, but the attributes of the folders that it lives in are also changed because of that. Now, we understand what's changed based on the attributes of the folders. So that means we know exactly where we need to go based on the vcache that we took the day before, so that we understand what our cache repository needs to instruct our file proxy to pull out of that NAS share. And then this just means that we're ultimately going to get that really fast incremental backup. And you'll see on there that we're going to then store that into that short-term retention. So how do we then scale this up accordingly? So I've mentioned around the file proxy very briefly. The file proxy is a Windows server. This could be server core, and it could be, or full UI Windows server. It could be any Windows box, to be honest. It doesn't, if licensing is an issue, then it could be any supported Windows box that we support, desktop versions as well. So what I'm seeing actually, so we're a good couple of months into the release of V10, is that the file proxy works really well to distribute the load over many file proxies to get the data backed up as fast as possible. And then we noticed that actually the incrementals aren't that big. Let's say they're 2% at maximum. And actually, being able to scale back those file proxies back into one is a viable, or two is a viable solution to that. But on day one, let's have as many file proxies taking as many concurrent tasks as possible to get the job done. And then we're going to do those incrementals thereafter with one or two proxies. And that's completely scalable, and you don't have to buy additional hardware, node-based hardware to be able to do that. These could be virtual machines. These could be physical machines. They can double up as well as your VMware proxies. It's just a software service that is being installed onto this system. So how does that work? We use the concept of a CRC tree. This is a hash sum that is stored within the cache repository, and we can go at that file share and we can load balance the concurrent tasks over those file proxies to then get that data into our backup repository. Which then leads me on to, right, so where do we store this data? So we have the concept of a short-term retention. The short-term retention is a simple repository, could be a scale-out backup repository, could be a dedupe device, ultimately anything that we support in Veeam backup replication as a repository. The difference here is that it's not the same VBK format that we have for our image-based backups. This is a completely new backup format. This is an object-oriented file structure. So just to note that we can back up to scale-out backup repository, but the new capacity tier, so the ability to tier our image-based backups into object storage, that will be ignored for NAS-based backups. But I'll get on to what is also in this in the next couple of slides. So the concept of this is that this is for really fast recovery. This is for fast short-term retention or short-term restores. So generally you're going to see 7, 14, 30-day type retention, depending on obviously how big that short-term retention or repository is. But yeah, this is to get you out of any issues on the local site. Now, I've seen customers since run with just one copy, one day's retention on that short-term retention, and that's completely viable for that. So we've also got the concept of a long-term retention, and this is where we archive older versions or older file versions into cheaper storage. Now, what do we mean by cheaper storage? That could be a dedupe device. Again, this could be any supported repository that we have within Veeam, but it also could be object storage. This could be S3 compatible storage. This could be AWS S3. This could be Microsoft Azure Blob Storage or IBM Cloud. All of the same object storage that we have from our image-based or our capacity tier offering as well. What we've also got here, and I'll try and remember to show it in the demo, is that we can define or exclude files and folders out of the backup chain at both the short-term retention, but also to the long-term. So if you've got MP3s that you don't want to store in that short-term retention, that's fine. We can exclude them at that point. But then let's say we're backing up also MP4s. We don't want MP4s to go for whatever reason into our long-term retention. We can exclude them at that stage. One more storage component here is this secondary copy. This secondary copy gives us the ability to send a retention to an offsite location. Again, same repository functions, not object storage, but everything else. And what we're seeing here is this is for disaster recovery. We're seeing 1 to 30-day type retention being sent over to a secondary site, which allows them to just have that copy of data in that secondary location. Just to round out what the components are as well from a management point of view. So Veeam backup replication is where everything happens in terms of configuration, job scheduling, etc. Enterprise Manager is going to give you the ability to universally search those NAS-based backups, so you can find individual files and folders and restore them. Also gives you a bit of self-service capability. And Veeam 1 that I haven't mentioned yet gives you some sort of insight into what your NAS is doing, but also what your NAS backups are looking like.
I mean, I think one thing that really stands out for me there, and I think it's really important in this, is some of the kind of the core concepts right in the base of this. Obviously simplicity, efficiency, scalability are absolutely crucial. I think in modern data strategies, the idea that we can manage this stuff really easily, that we can manage it at scale, and that we can be efficient. And automation, I thought was really interesting with the idea of the proxies, that we can create proxies as we need them, we can close proxies down as we don't. That's again a key component of modern IT infrastructure and modern strategy. But the thing that I think really stood out for me in what you were talking about there was this importance of consistency. The ability that we've got Veeam protecting all of these different NAS workloads wherever they might live, however they're looked. But because Veeam's got hold of them and is kind of the one version of the truth, if you like, the flexibility that gives us in where we can then restore that data. So not only can we protect it from anywhere, but that ability to restore to anywhere. And I think for lots of organizations, and I'm sure for lots of our customers who are watching this, that is a very, very attractive idea, because it gives them some real flexibility. You talked about that idea earlier on of this as a migration tool almost. If I'm looking to put data in the public cloud, if I'm looking to move from one NAS device to another, if I'm looking to move from Windows to Linux or vice versa, that actually this one single consistent tool allows us to do all of those things. So I think that's very impressive and very interesting.
Yeah, and the concept of that backup and that migration is that if we move from NAS A to NAS B, then we don't have to, whereas traditionally you would have to go and take a full backup from that. We don't have to do that. If we've performed that migration, we can just continue that incremental backup because we've got the Vcache of the file and folder structure, which is pretty impressive in that we don't have to, it is ultimately a forever forward incremental. So we have to take that, let's say 50 hours plus for that first full backup, depending on how many proxies you deploy. But then after that, it's just the changes. If you're only changing 100 gig a day or 100 meg a day, that's all we're going to have to scale or size for. On the automation piece as well. So we've written, so all of the new functionality from a NAS point of view is we have a PowerShell reference for all of this. And one of the things that we've been doing in our lab is how do we dynamically deploy and destroy these file proxies, and that's all out there. It's on Veeam Hub. Very simply, you tell it how many proxies you want, and off it goes. It deploys them based on the template. And once you're finished, if you wanted, you could say, right, now get rid of them. And that then becomes quite interesting in terms of how you resource, or how you use your IT resource to manage this. We don't want you having to use or always have X amount of file proxies up and running. The same for VMware proxies or Hyper-V proxies. We don't want you to have them up and running all the time if you don't need them. But make better use of that resource. So being dynamic like that is very much a part of what we're doing from a product strategy point of view. So on just to visualize this, and we'll make sure we send these out as well so you can see what it is. But just to put that into another visual is that if file 3.11 has changed, which you see over on that right hand side, it will automatically change the folder anyway within Windows or within Linux. The attributes of that folder changes, the modified date, etc., as well as the folder 3. So that gives us that route to market to only have to go and look at 3.11, because 3.12, 3.13, they have not changed since the last backup. So that just really highlights that incremental backup again. Okay, so 3 more slides and we'll get to some demo. So I mentioned already around the restore, which is, in my opinion, one of the most important parts of this. Anyone can lift and shift data from A to B. Yeah, okay, some people do it in more of an efficient way, but really, when it comes to it, the restore is the most important part. So already mentioned around the entire share restore, so being able to take a particular version of the restore point and being able to send that back. There's also a nice UI slider that allows you to go back to the individual restore points. This is really important if you're looking at, like, obviously complete loss of storage service. Your NAS has gone down, it's broken, major storage level corruption, potentially a migration from NAS A to NAS B, as we mentioned. But also the flexibility of being able to recover this to any location and being granular at that as well. So you don't have to recover everything to a new location. The rollback to a point in time. Now, this is the important one that I wanted to mention again, is this is going to revert all the files that have modified since the last, or since a specific date, to the previous version, the last known good configuration, that quick rollback. But yeah, that's a thing. I'll try and show that in the demo. And then obviously being able to have visibility and the ability to individually recover files and folders back to either the original location or to a secondary location for other purposes, to be able to see that, as well as being able to have visibility of different file and folder versions. So that's the important bit there. And again, we'll try and show that. Enterprise Manager is our self-service HTML5 front end. So within here, we've got the ability to mount those NAS backups, gives it a bit of visibility on how those backups are working, bit of change rate, etc. If you don't have Veeam 1, gives you some information on what that looks like. But also, biggest thing is around universal search. So being able to actually go in there and find a particular file or folder that you're looking for, to be able to then either download it locally to that machine using the HTML5 client, or restore it back to the original location, either by overwriting or keeping both of the original file and folder. And another part here is that this is focused on self-service restore, so different restore roles. If you're willing to give the keys to the castle, or some of the key to the castle for your users, then you've got the ability to give them access to this so that they can go and recover their own data if you so wish. So from a Veeam 1 point of view, there's a few things here. We want to be able to have some sort of insight or visibility into what's happening, not only from a monitoring and alarms point of view. If something goes bad, we want to know, but also reports. So what's happening, what NAS backup jobs are, how long are they taking, how many file shares are we backing up, what's the status of that, what are the stats of that, how long is it taking, what's that change rate, because it still amazes me how many times I speak to people and we have no idea how much data is changing. Veeam 1 can give you that visibility of that. So I think with that, Paul, I will jump into the demo, I think.
Yeah, because I think there's loads of really interesting stuff in there. And actually, just to pick up on one of those last bits you talked about, I think that integration with tools like Veeam 1, allowing us to see what files are getting changed, what the usage looks like, who's accessing them. I talk a lot about the idea that the more insight that you can have into how your data's being used, whether that's from a data protection point of view or just generally how production data's being used, all of those, you can never have too much of that kind of insight into how it's being used. And if you have no tools in place at the moment and you've got access to the Veeam availability suite, then Veeam 1 is absolutely a tool you should be looking to deploy.
Yeah, so let's jump over into the demo. I just want to show this again, should be towing the line of that simplicity. So we jump into infrastructure. Now, those familiar with Veeam, you'll see in here you've got virtual infrastructure, physical infrastructure. Now you'll see this new file shares and also a bit of a summary of what's happened in the last 24 hours. So from a file share point of view, you're going to see file servers, which consists of a Linux box and it's itself, but ultimately here we can add in our file servers. We've got NFS and we've got SMB. Now, to add that, it's a case of choosing which one it is, and I'm just going to take one that I had before. So this is us adding our source share. So we're going to define our shared folder, and obviously in the file server, you're going to define the managed server. We're going to provide some credentials. Now, these credentials, by minimum, they have to be read. They have to have read access. Now, just bear that in mind that if we need to have access to restore, then you probably want to have some sort of backup operator mode as well. All of the requirements and permissions are in a user guide there. I also mentioned around what option we want to use in terms of advanced transport modes. So you can see here that I'm going to use the VSS snapshot, but we've got these. And then also this tick box down the bottom. So if this doesn't work, for whatever reason, then we've got the ability to tick this, and that means it will fail back to backing up directly, which will give you all of the lock files and all of the issues that we see there. But this might be the only way of getting a good, at least a strong backup rather than completely failing. Or you can untick it and you won't have anything. Then we've got the ability to add our file proxies in here. So I've got just one file proxy at the moment. I must have removed the others, but we can be quite generic in what, or selective, sorry, in what proxies we use, or we can say use all of them. Then we've got this cache repository. I'm going to show you what that looks like. It's just a Veeam repository that sits as close to the NAS share as possible on the fastest disk. And also we've got this backup IO control. Now we appreciate that not everyone's going to have a fast enterprise scale type NAS device from Dell EMC or NetApp or one of the big boys. And you could be anywhere in between that down to a very small NAS device, a home NAS device, for example. So what this does is this allows you to decide how much of the load we want to take for the backup. Now, this might, by default, it's going to sit in the middle. Have a play with this, understand what impact it makes to the CPU on your production NAS. But yeah, this gives us that bit more of a control, because what we are finding is even some of the enterprise where we had that keyed up to faster backup, if that's performing already at 80% and we try and throw additional load at it, our backup was potentially taking it above and causing a deterioration of performance to the production. So we wanted to put this in place so that we had that control. And I expect fully that later on down the line, this gets automated, very much like our backup IO control for VMware workloads. So that's it. That's as simple as that. We've added our SMB share. Now, just to quickly run over to the backup repositories. So here's my cache repository, and simply put, this is a simple repository, right? We're using a repository server, which is itself. We're using a disk in there. There's no tick box. There's no nothing in here. You create your repository as normal, and then you just point to it. I've just named it accordingly. And if we go into that, actually, you'll see, one, it's very small because all it does is contain the file backup cache, and you'll have one for each of your NAS backups. Now, they're unreadable by the eye, like Notepad's not going to open. You're not going to get any detail from them. But these are the cache files that I mentioned in regards to the change file tracking. The other thing to mention in here is file proxies. So you can see here that I've got 4 file shares and one being disabled. These are Windows machines. You can see that I've automated them. And again, when you go to add these, you've got the ability to add a file backup proxy. And again, you just need to define how many concurrent tasks based on the CPU. This is exactly the same as a normal VMware proxy that we have. You'll see actually that 116 is a file proxy, but it's also a vSphere proxy. They can double up. They're just Windows services. These are server core systems that are deployed dynamically as well. So then getting onto the job, what does a job look like? If we look at this one, again, want it to look as very much the same as what our existing VMware or physical backups look like. So we give it a name. We choose our file share. So in here, we've got the drop down of all our new file shares. You saw that we added this one. We can then get quite granular into this if we only want to take a certain folder from the share. This is where you can see here that I'm already excluding certain snapshot folders. We do that by default, but if we did want to do star.mp3, we could do that here as well. In fact, I don't want that to be the case because that will ruin my demo jobs. This is where I spoke about the short-term retention. So I want to keep it. I want to send it to this short-term retention. I want to keep 7 days worth here. This is actually a dedupe device that I've got. But I want to keep previous file versions for 3 months, and I'm going to send that to an AWS S3. But I could literally choose any of those other options that are available. This is where we can say, okay, be more granular on what we actually keep. So I could say star.mp4s, as I mentioned before, but we could also say, I want you to keep active file versions of 10 and deleted file versions of X amount as well. Under advanced is, okay, what permissions do you want us to have? What permissions do you want to back up as well? So by default, it's going to be folder level only because of speed, but we can also go files and folders. We're going to do our own compression on there, which depending on obviously what data it is and as to what ratio you're going to get. We've also got the ability to add encryption here, things like health checks against the data, notifications against the job. Now, job scripts as well. So if you were going to trigger a native storage snapshot, we can run that as a script here as well and set that as default. You'll see here that this pop-up, I haven't set a tag for the location of where it's coming from, but we've got that ability to do that in our system as well, so that you can stay compliant and that you know where the data resides. Then if I just choose one of these, so I'm choosing a secondary repository. This is the secondary copy. Now we can use a custom retention policy. If you remember, I'm keeping 7 days on my primary or on my short-term retention. We can get down to months here. We can actually just have whatever you wanted. We can choose a different encryption key. So you saw where I set the encryption key for the primary backup. We can have a different one. So this protects us against malicious activity. And this chooses when do you want that to copy over to that secondary location. Remove that. Simple schedule. You've all seen this if you're a Veeam customer, and that's it. That runs. From a recovery point of view, if I jump here, again, what do you want to recover? File share. We've got those 3 options that I've already touched on. We've got this restore individual files. He says, I'm sure I clicked on it. Here we go. So we need to then choose our share. And what we're going to do, notice how we didn't select a restore point, a particular restore point, because within here, we're just going to mount all of the metadata. So we're not actually going to mount the backup file like we do within our VBK and our image-based backups. We're actually only going to mount or give access to the metadata of the files. So you see, we're going to use the latest restore point, and you can see I can go into here. I can see what those files look like within my downloads folder. I can go all time. So all time actually gives us the versions of the file that we've got. So this would be where I haven't changed anything, but ultimately if I did have, in fact, I better have in here. No, clearly not. But if I had a copy of that data I would see backup, 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 and archive, and it will tell you your modification date and your size, etc. And if you wanted to go back to a specific point, restore point, then we can choose that here, look, and be able to go to a specific point in time. So that's the individual or the granular file level recovery. Now, one demo that I love running is everyone's got some ransomware to run, right? So if we let's have a look at this blog post, right? So you can see here that everything looks right. And if we want to simulate a ransomware attack of that, if I just run this script that I've got, actually run it. What this is going to do is, if I'm quick enough, you'll see all of those modified dates all changing now to 12:46. So that's lab time, or is that now? Yeah. So you see that ran pretty quick. And you'll see now that this is all encrypted. No good, can't read that. So this is simulating, and you'll see that some haven't changed because it didn't attack that file for whatever reason. Typical ransomware scenario. So what we do is we can come in here, we can go to the file share. Now we might have only took that backup last night. So, but let's go back to a specific point in time. Cade share, I think it's that. Maybe it's that one. Maybe that's quicker. It's going to load all the restore points. Now, this is the slider that I mentioned. So if we know that, because maybe it's not always the case that that one will get you out of jail from a ransomware attack. That ransomware attack might have been working and only encrypting a file a day. So we might need to roll back to a few days ago. What it's going to do under here, you can actually see, okay, yeah, we know that 12:13, they all look good after, well, before, especially before 12:47 on the 31st anyway. So let's roll back to last night at midnight or lunchtime. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually just make that restore. So you'll see we're not going to touch this, the one that I mentioned, we're not going to touch this at all because nothing's changed. It's not modified since the last backup. So imagine that with hundreds of gig of data, where hundreds of gig of data haven't been changed. We don't need to restore those files. And as if by magic, he says, all of these date modifiers should roll back to what they were before very quickly. And if we open up my file now, we're back in business and we're back up and running with that good folder. You can see that we only restored 37 meg, 16 files, but there were 17 files in total because it didn't touch the one that we opened after the ransomware attack. And hopefully that's a very fast demo to show like the how quick we can get that recovered. But you think of that about at scale, you maybe don't even know what files and folders have been modified within your share. So being able to just quickly revert back to the last known good configuration could be a good way of getting back in business.
And I think that's for anybody who's witnessed that kind of ransomware type attack or any kind of attack where you've lost data and it's masses of data and you don't really know what data has been impacted, the ability, because I think with all kind of data recovery solutions, what's really crucial is that when you need it, when your backs are against a wall, that it's simple, it's fast, it takes away almost a lot of the thinking for you. And I think that's a fabulous demonstration of how flexible that kind of restore option is. And I know we've spoken before about, I think one of the important things about how how Veeam have approached this NAS data protection solution is to implement all the things that Veeam are good at, is make it simple, make it fast, make it efficient, and make it just work. And I think they've applied that fantastically well to this NAS data protection element as well.
Yeah, I think the important thing, remember this is NAS backup version 1 for Veeam as well. So if you're pretty impressed with that wait until you see what, I'm already working on what version 2 looks like, and there's some pretty incredible things that we're implementing into that. And yeah, I think that's the important thing, is that we're not just there to tick a box. the software defined is a massive importance to us as well, in that you don't need to buy specific hardware for us to get the right amount of performance. But yeah, the flexibility is key to us as well. And the other thing is that, so say something happens to your VBR server from a NAS point of view, or just in general, say you use Veeam for your virtual machines, your physical and your NAS now, and that VBR server dies or your site is no longer accessible, we can still access, or you'd be able to spin up another VBR server somewhere else and still be able to access those archived repositories that we touched on with the object storage, and still be able to access data at that point. The portability doesn't change, although it doesn't use the VBK format. It doesn't change the concept of, well, we still need to be able to be portable and be able to recover that data, even if the original VBR server is no longer available.
Okay, Mike, I think that's fantastic. That's a really good introduction to what Veeam are doing in this NAS space. I think it's very, very interesting that the approach that Veeam have taken. There's been some benefit to releasing this version in V10, and as you talked about, kind of this is just a version 1. And for me, I think that's very impressive. Deals with all of the modern challenges that that people are looking for and are trying to deal with as this ever and growing use of NAS across enterprises of all types. So I think, hugely powerful stuff. And Michael, thank you for spending some time to share that with us. I think that's been really useful. And for people watching this, thank you for taking the time to watch this on-demand presentation, and do look out for more Gardener Systems tech videos in the near future.